Well, thank you for everybody for coming in. Wish to introduce Chris Berry, Mountain House Partners, Anthony Wawelski, who I think you all know from Parler and now Cobalt 27, and Amir Adani, who's President and CEO of Uranium Energy Corp. And what that means is it's going to be an interesting panel because we're talking about commodities of the future, and that means we're going to end up talking about some new metals like lithium and cobalt, and talking about, I don't know if can I call uranium an old metal almost. So there's going to be some sporting comments, I suspect, on the back of that. So the idea is that we talk about new energy systems, what makes cleaner fuels, renewables. We're going to touch on the whole concept of grid storage or grid supply and battery storage, what metals are useful there. Electric vehicles and new technologies, how that's going to impact the supply-demand balance, and how we're supposed to work out what capital to commit, where and when, and then the costs of all of this versus traditional electrical power generation. So we'll talk about lithium, vanadium, hydropower, solar power, wind power, and all of that. So maybe if we can start off with Chris Berry. Give us your thoughts.
So thank you for the opportunity to lead off the panel today. It's interesting. I'm not sure if these metals are really metals of the future because the demand that we're seeing is today and it's right now. My focus predominantly over the last 7 or 8 years has been in the battery metal space, lithium, cobalt, and graphite, with a special nod recently to nickel and copper. And, it's interesting, even as recently as a couple of years ago, you would look at the lithium space, and it was around maybe 175, 190,000 tons total demand. And you'd tell people, I think that by 2025, the lithium market can double to 400,000 tons, and you'd get laughed out of people's offices. Well, today, those concerns around demand have melted away, and a 400,000 ton market for lithium by 2025 is the lowest of the low estimates. Most people are 600, 700, 800,000 tons. I've seen a couple of estimates of 1 million tons of demand. Of course, this is all predicated upon EV uptake, which Anthony and Amir and I were just talking about out before we came in here. So, look, it's not a bubble, okay? I realize I'm being recorded, so I hope I'm right. The bubble typically forms, we know how these markets work, especially for the small metals. What happens is the price increases for various reasons, and you see this huge influx of companies, okay? And so you now have anywhere from 200 to 300 lithium companies in particular, and that's really where the bubble is. The demand is really not in question. The real question that I struggle with, and I know a lot of investors are struggling with, is on the supply side. Is it going to be more brine? Is it going to be more hard rock? Geopolitical considerations in the lithium triangle, things like that. So, I'm still particularly bullish on lithium. I think at the end of the day, obviously, you've got to find large, scalable assets run specifically by management teams that have done this before. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges in lithium going forward. You need this blend of technical and operational expertise as well as financial expertise or financial acumen around structuring offtake agreements. So that's really, I think, what you want to look for going forward. The demand, again, is not really an issue at this point in time. I think it's just balancing the supply out to 2025.
Anthony, now perhaps you can tell us a bit about cobalt and your thoughts on how that's all going to work with the new demand that's coming through.
Yeah, I think probably all three of us kind of share the same views to a certain extent, and that's really that we're sitting at the front of what is a structural change in two of the most important markets in the world, namely the energy market and the automobile market. And first of all, to think briefly about the energy market, you're talking about roughly 50% of all crude is used in transportation, specifically for cars, and up to 75% if you include in things like if you include in things like airplanes and autobuses. And then on the other hand, in the automobile industry, you have what is a complete upheaval in the form of mobility as a service. And more specifically today, what we're talking about is mobility as a service when combined with electric vehicles. And when I think about the world, I think my kids won't have driver's licenses, and in the not too distant future, probably car ownership will be completely disrupted, and most people in this room will not own a car in the same way they do today. And when I ask myself, like, when is that going to happen? I think that's really the important question. And you know, when we started looking at Paula at this idea of technology and disruption, I think one theme was reoccurring, and that is that there's this tipping point in new technology, and whether that's tinfoil in the early 1900s, whether it's your laptop computer, or whether it's your iPhone. And that tipping point sits around, you know, the cost of whatever the new technology is, the new disruptive technology, and the industrial capacity to produce that new technology. And what I would tell you here today is that we are 8 quarters in on quarter growth of EV sales. Last week was really, I think, a watershed moment. Quarter sales in China was up 63% on EV sales. You know, similar numbers globally are put out now. And I think the question that we really need to ask ourselves is, you know, what if we're wrong about electric vehicle penetration rates? Wall Street consensus is 8 to 12%. In 2025, that implies the need for 4 times more lithium production than today, 2.5 times more cobalt production. There's a 2 million metric ton nickel deficit. So, you know, what if we're wrong and this actual, you know, acceleration of penetration rate happens? And I'll leave you with one thought before Amir speaks, and that is, like, look into your pockets. You know, everyone in this room has either a Samsung or an Apple or, you know, whatever your phone is. When Apple launched 10 years ago with the iPhone, you go back and you read the reviews, and people said, look, you know, in 20 years, 20 or 30% of people, you know, they might have a smartphone. By the way, they're clunky and the battery doesn't work, and who wants this piece of junk anyway? Well, here we are 10 years on, and 100% of people in this room who want a smartphone have one. It happened incredibly fast, and I would argue that we're at the tipping point now with the price of cars almost now in, you know, in parallel, whether it's gas or electric, with, you know, the acceleration of demand in China. And so we really need to think about what that's going to mean for these metals over time.
And the good thing is we've got Amir here who's going to make the case, I suspect, for where all the power is going to come from to feed the electric vehicles that we're talking about.
I thought I was going to talk about Bitcoin.
Oh, okay.
Uranium.
Go for it.
I think I was asked to be a part of this because but we really can't look at the EV revolution and the battery metals in a vacuum without the appreciation that every battery has to be connected to the grid, and without being able to recharge with electricity, the picture is quite meaningless. And I think when we kind of step back and look at this as a continuum of basically from the grid to the battery, we have to kind of consider some of the balancing points here to think about longer-term developments and also where policy is going to come from. So we just talked about sort of, let's say, Anthony's thoughts on the penetration of EV vehicles. Well, you got to balance that out and say, okay, well, what are some of the greater kind of concerns out there when we think about electricity generation? And balancing that also with environmental concerns around decarbonization of the economy. So the issue here really goes back to the fact that at a very high level when it comes to energy consumption, for most of the last 100 years, 1/4 of the world's population has consumed 3/4 of the world's energy resources. And now the other 3/4 of the world's population is going to basically have the same almost demand requirements as we've had in the Western world. Nuclear power has been around for 40 years, but for the last 40 years, nuclear power has been really exclusively an energy tool in the Western world, France, US. It was developed in Japan and Germany. You look at nuclear power today and what's happening with its growth, it's truly becoming a global source of power generation. And yes, it's China and India, but at the same time you have Abu Dhabi and Saudi Arabia and Iran, like you're talking about basically the Persian Gulf countries that are very hydrocarbon rich, developing nuclear power. And it goes back to nothing more than the air pollution issues taking place in the largest Asian cities. So how can we have this incredible penetration of EVs in China when everyone at the end of the day has to go home and recharge these vehicles? And air pollution is public enemy #1 in Asia right now, in 25 of the biggest cities in Asia. And without being able to recharge with baseload power, which is 24/7 power capacity, this just isn't possible. So I think when we look at the fact that there's a record number of reactors being built in China and India right now to facilitate the ability to have 24/7 electricity generation that could be around the clock, where we can recharge everything from our cars to our phones to other devices that all need electricity. It really speaks to, I think, a new paradigm that we're seeing in nuclear power growth that has never existed before, because we've never had so many different people in the world needing to consume electricity at the same time. And issues around greenhouse gases have never been as acute as they are today in the history that we've had over the last 100 years. So I think you really have to balance these thoughts and ideas around how do we reduce the carbon footprint? How do we deal with greenhouse gases? How do we provide baseload electricity that's 24/7, especially in the mega cities of Asia? And to me, when you come to that conclusion, nuclear power comes out as a big winner. And the reason why I think we're seeing now record level of growth in nuclear power expansion is exactly due to that. And frankly, it's a little bit calmer right now in the uranium mining business to try to develop projects. I think when I look at what's happening in the lithium space right now and the excitement around EVs, it reminds me of the uranium sector in 2006. In 2006, we went from having 20 companies in the world doing uranium exploration and mining, 20. By 2007, there were 600 companies worldwide in the uranium exploration and development business. Uranium energy was part of that. And when I look back at that as executives who are trying to build companies in those sectors, even though the momentum is fun to have, it can become sometimes distracting, and there could be wastefulness in terms of capital raised and deployed that doesn't necessarily generate that much more new supply. Whereas I think right now, being CEO of a uranium mining company, I find it's a lot more efficient to buy deals accretively, buy projects accretively, deploy capital more rationally. Cost of capital might be high, but as long as you're putting assets together, it becomes quite interesting to be able to develop at this point. So it could also be very dangerous, I think, when you get these bubbles. I know someone was asking me, are we going to have an oversupply of lithium? It's like saying in 2007, are we going to have an oversupply of uranium because uranium is hot? No, we didn't. We ended up just having a lot of wastefulness where, there's just too much of a bubble that's created and too much inefficiencies that come about where investors throw money at these companies and capital allocation doesn't become the most effective idea.
It's interesting because there hasn't been a lot of news out of China that I've seen recently about the commissioning of these new nuclear plants. And I wonder if you guys have got some thoughts on that. And where else do you see power coming from?
Look, I think one of the big things that we're seeing is, and it's certainly not going to solve the problem, I think it just augments and assists what will ultimately need to be policy changes for nuclear to become interesting again, for instance, in the U.S., and Amir could speak to that better than I can. But I think one of the really interesting things that you're seeing now is residential solar taking the shape now of roofs and battery technology such that, potentially the vanadium redox battery could sit inside of a subdivision and in places like Arizona and California collect material energy units that could be used to actually supply the home. And I don't think any of that is going to ultimately result in being off the grid, as it were. But what it probably will do is give breathing room for what does need to be a broader power solution for the grid. So, I don't know how long it takes Amir to permit and build a nuclear reactor, but I promise you it's more than a couple years. And so I think what you can see is between now and the moment when 25 or 30% of people are driving EVs, you can have the solar technology and the battery technology step in the interim for what ultimately will need to be a broader, longer-term solution.
Chris?
I mean, I would agree with all of that. I mean, I think you're seeing renewable power prices continue to fall along with battery prices as well. And I think one of the challenges that, a lot of investors come to me with when they're trying to understand this whole EV theme or just the whole lithium-ion theme is, what is the optimal battery chemistry? Is it lithium-ion? Is it vanadium redox? Is it sodium sulfur? And the answer is that there is no clear winner across different usages, if you will. I mean, EVs are clearly going to be using lithium ion for at least the next 10 years, in my opinion. I say that based on conversations I've had with major battery manufacturers in
Different
Asia.
batteries will be used for different things.
Correct,
Right.
correct. And so vanadium redox, to your point, is an ideal chemistry for large-scale energy storage. Just then you start to have to look at economics and things like that. But ultimately, vanadium redox makes a lot more sense for large-scale energy storage than lithium ion, based on the economics.
You're never going to have a vanadium redox battery in your car. But there's
Correct.
also like a level of nuance here, which is important, I think, for investors. So take vanadium, for instance. This is an incredible technology, and you have vanadium prices on the move. So with lithium ion, you had a VHS Betamax problem, which is to say that you can argue Betamax was a better technology, but VHS won. You can argue till you're blue in the face about what might have been better for the electric vehicle, but the lithium ion battery has won and definitively won for a decade. With things like storage, for like a residential or commercial application in the vanadium redox battery, it hasn't won yet, and I don't know. Probably it will, maybe it won't. I don't know. But the point is, if the price of vanadium moves too hard in the next 12 to 14 months, what you might find is the vanadium redox battery technology was the best technology, but lead acid wins by just way of an analogy because the price of lead didn't move and the distribution of the lead acid battery is more ubiquitous. I'm not saying that's going to be the case, but what I am saying is, for certain technologies and certain applications, we're still in the very early days. So you have to be wary of the promote, as it were, because if the underlying basic material moves too fast, it will actually cannibalize the demand for said battery. And where lithium and that complex is fortunate is that there's something like $100 to $300 billion of infrastructure built for the automobile, and it's predicated on the lithium-ion battery, and so that's there. But for some of these other applications, it's unclear yet who the winner is going to be in terms of the battery technology, and so you have to be a little bit wary of picking a horse, and getting it wrong, because there are definitely going to be winners and there are going to be losers as well.
Yeah, and vanadium is 30 to 40% of the cost of the battery, whereas lithium is 3 to 4% of the cost of the battery. So, the volatility there is something that, to your point, you really need to think about when you're investing.
Certainly, there are a lot of questions around about what is the battery chemistry going to be that wins. And for me, lithium is just such a light metal. Nothing else is lightweight like that, and electric vehicles want to be light for all sorts of reasons. So that seems to be the winning factor. Never mind all the other issues.
Remember, lithium ion is the battery, but within the battery, there's the battery chemistry. And so the most pervasive chemistry, or ubiquitous chemistry, I would say, is nickel, manganese, cobalt. The secondary chemistry, which Tesla uses, is the NCA, the nickel, cobalt, aluminum. So even within the lithium-ion battery, there are kind of multiple competing chemistries, and there's other chemistries as well. And I think when people talk about a new battery technology or substitution, typically they're either talking their own book or they actually don't know what they're talking about. And why I say that is because when we talk about, lithium's gone up or cobalt's gone up, what we're really talking about is innovation within the chemistries. And so, today the main chemistry is a 622, or the chemistry which is currently being rolled out, which means 6-part nickel, 2-part manganese, 2-part cobalt. The next real innovation is an 811, 8 nickel, 1 manganese, 1 cobalt. And then beyond that, you have potentially 8 years out the lithium air battery and solid state batteries. But all of these are effectively lithium-ion batteries, and so you're really talking about the nuance of the underlying chemistry being, the innovation there being kind of what's driving the change, and not a complete substitute for the lithium-ion battery, at least not kind of for the next 6 to 8 years that anyone can foresee.
But assuming we get good growth in take-up of EVs, and that seems to be happening, how are we going to power all these things? How are we going to get... Because you talk about solar on roofs and stuff like that, but distributed power just isn't going to do enough. It's not going to create enough generation.
Depends on what you're talking about as well, right? I mean, it's very different. I think probably England is going to be more of a problem than in the U.S. And there's also kind of factors about, well, when do you charge your car? Well, most people are going to charge it at night, so this is actually beneficial to the grid in the coming years. But ultimately, over the course of, say, a decade, which is probably like the terms that Amir would think of for reactors being built, there's certainly going to have to be broader solutions to the way that we think about energy, especially if we're moving away from coal.
But Chris, is the grid going to cope with this?
I don't think we know. when we talk about EV demand at this point, I mean, it's largely aspirational. I mean, to your point, we can have 8 to 10 to 12 to 15% EV penetration by 2025, and it certainly looks like it's going that way based on the stats that you had just mentioned. But you know, we don't know, and so I think one of the challenges right now is you have this. You know, there's a guy in the lithium industry that calls the whole renewable sector a jump ball right now because there's so much investment and so many questions in the space right now. But again, back to Amir's point, I think the only, you know, realistic sort of base load solution is nuclear. And, you know, that obviously the challenges that nuclear has had in the last few years have tended to work against it. But sooner or later, I mean, if we really want to have an electrified future, if you will, nuclear is just going to have to play a part. I mean, the energy density issues around renewables and the lack of reliability are real challenges, and they don't increase, or in other words, they don't get better at sort of a Moore's law rate. Energy density, for example, might increase at 5 to 6 to 7% per year, and that's just not enough.
Let's just touch base on what we already know right now when it comes to capacity factors. Capacity factor for any kind of electricity generation is really the key to this whole thing. So when you look at renewables, solar, wind, the capacity factor is 25 to 30%. That means it works 25 or 30% of the time. Even natural gas has a capacity factor of 55% to 60%. Nuclear has a capacity factor of 95%. So in a 24-hour cycle, it works 95% of the time. So when you think about the fact that, very practically speaking, we all drive, if we were all to drive electric cars tomorrow in London, we all come home at the same time in the evening. We all want to charge the cars at the same time. We all want to charge our devices at the same time. It doesn't work if the source of power or the grid is working 25% of the time or 30% of the time. You need to have 95% or 100% capacity factor. So I think that's the critical thing to really touch on and understand, number one. Number two, nuclear last year and the year before that had its best 2 years in 25 years in terms of new reactors added to the grid. So this isn't a 10-year story or 15-year story. As we speak, there are 59 reactors under construction. Each year, there are a handful or 5 to 10 being added to the grid. In China, there's 29 reactors under construction. Just 3 weeks ago, Bill Gates signed a very large agreement with a Chinese nuclear technology company to develop small modular reactors, which is a really groundbreaking technology to bring the size of a 1 gigawatt reactor down, make it more available in remote areas where it can be developed. And so I still go back and think that you really have to, I think, consider all these points. I think we have an issue with maybe kind of the public relation image that nuclear power has, especially because of the Fukushima incident 7 years ago. But if we want to continue to kind of think about having a modern transportation system, a modern healthcare and education system, again, all those things are going to require grid reliability and grid resilience. And those are key words that don't necessarily corroborate with renewable. Reliability and resilience doesn't collaborate with something that works 25% of the time. But I think, you know, what Bill Gates is doing with the Chinese is fascinating to look at because SMRs are a really key part of nuclear technology in the future.
Well, you can be sure they've done their research.
There's also one other, this is a really important point, which is back to what my initial comment was. You're really looking at a fundamental shift in mobility, and most of you maybe not even believe that, but you know, we were just in California with an automaker, and we were talking about it, looking at the plans. Car ownership is ultimately going to go down, right? You know, it's my view, and that like mobility as a service is a real phenomenon, and there's also like layers of nuance here. Like for instance, fuel cells, in my view, don't work in a widespread kind of fashion because of the infrastructure. Kind of back to this VHS Betamax thing, like the EV infrastructure in the U.S. is built. I mean, you can drive across America now, stopping at supercharger stations. However, where the fuel cell might work is on fixed routes. So you're in New York or LA, and you've got all your buses are sitting on fuel cells, and you have one point where they all cross through their routes. So there's going to be a nuance to to the rollout of these applications, and not all of them will take as much power. And then I think with cars, especially kind of past 25, I don't think we should think about it in terms of every single person in this room owning their own personal EV. I think we really have to kind of get our minds around what happens when the way that we travel is different and you're not driving your car, and it's not science fiction anymore. Like this is already, if you go to Palo Alto right now, every kind of 5 minutes, a Google or an Uber car, which is driving itself, will drive past you. And sitting in London, it's hard to appreciate that, but literally in San Francisco and Palo Alto now, they're all over. And so that change, I don't think we can feel it, most of us, because we're not sitting there, but it will be on us. And one of the answers to the stress on the grid is simply going to be that we may not ultimately feel that huge impact because we may not own as many vehicles.
Well, we're out of time, but Chris, can we have a last word from you? Any closing thoughts?
I still think there's, despite the questions that I think we've raised on the panel about some of the uncertainties, I think that this is a tremendous opportunity. So learn everything you can about mobility and about the entire supply chain from upstream, midstream, and downstream, because I do agree with you that this is a fundamental shift in how energy is generated and used and stored, and it's predicated on secure supply of these metals and minerals that we've alluded to earlier. So learn as much as you can.
Well, there's no doubt this panel could go on all day, but we're going to stop here. And just a plug for SB Angel, we have produced a book on battery raw materials, a review of that, which I hope is useful, so please pick up a copy at our desk. Thank you.